Thank you very much. Aren't you all so well behaved? You know, an expectant hush as soon as we walk on stage. Thank you very much for that. My name's Julia Gillard. Can I welcome you to this panel event from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which I'm very privileged to be the inaugural chair of. At the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, our mission is to ensure that we live in a world where women can come through for leadership positions without any extra barriers or hurdles, the way that they are in the way of women today, and to have their leadership fairly evaluated, not through the prism of gender. And when we look around our world, the global statistics about how many women come through in politics, in business, in the law, in the news media, in technology, and reach leadership levels are pretty poor. None of those statistics are over 30%. Many of them are far closer to 20%. Some of them are under 20%. And if the rate of change was, you know, a fast rate of change, we might say, well, we can just wait a few years and it'll all be fine. But of course, it's not like that. The rate of change is in some of those statistics very slow, and in some areas we've gone backwards. So when we talk about leadership, we're talking about from the sort of first moment that a woman steps into her work-life journey and all of the hurdles and barriers that might be in the way. But it does kind of beg a question, and we knew that when we were starting to design the Institute, that of course there are many ways and many different versions of being a leader, and not all pathways to leadership are up a pyramid with a broad base and with a very narrow apex at the top and one person leading from the top. And there are different styles of leadership. And so tonight's panel is going to be a discussion about those varying views and perceptions of leadership. Now, I'm joined by two great panellists, and you're looking at that empty chair. I'm going to explain that in a moment. I'm joined by Alice Hood and by Yvette Williams. We will be joined by Jess Phillips. You will see her run at some point and join us on stage. She had to stay in the House to vote. I don't know what the vote is on, but you know, this is modern day Britain. It could be anything really, couldn't it? So when she arrives, she'll be able to tell us a bit about leadership and also what she's voted on. What I'm going to do now is turn the conversation over to the panellists who have joined me. I've asked each of them to say a bit about themselves and also how that shapes some of their perceptions of leadership. So Alice, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here as part of the panel. I wanted to slightly cheekily start by just saying how excited I was when I saw that Rosie Campbell had been appointed, just to embarrass Rosie, as the director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, because Rosie taught me on my master's course about 10 years ago, possibly. I couldn't quite believe it when I worked it out, but and was a genuine inspiration through her approach. And there is an example of an educator and a thinker who's a leader and has had an influence on me, and I know many, many other students and others who've kind of seen your work. So I'm really excited to see what you can achieve together through the Institute.
Thank you. I think we've got to complete the process of embarrassing Rosie now. So, Rosie, if you could stand up. I knew this was going to happen, but I've been keeping the secret all day. So this is Rosie Campbell, who is the new director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Right. She's just going to get us back for that later, but back to you.
She's just redrafting her really fiendish question.
Yeah.
So I'm Alice Hood. I head up the department that works on our equality and strategy work at the TUC, the national body for Britain's trade unions. And I've been there for about 10 years, actually, in various policy roles, and most recently in this job. And it's one that I'm actually job sharing in our own kind of small effort at actually practicing what we preach in terms of flexibility in all kinds of roles. That's something I've been job sharing since I came back from maternity leave earlier this year. And in that role this year, it's been a really interesting opportunity because it's been our 150th anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the foundation of the TUC. And what we wanted to do in marking that anniversary was look back at some of the stories of some of the unsung women and men who've shaped the trade union movement over our history and are continuing to shape it today. And in the process of looking back, there were all of these incredible stories of women leaders, and they may not have been the individuals that were around the table at that very first Trade Union Congress meeting, but they were there organising in workplaces, they were there organising in communities, they were leaders. Their stories weren't necessarily always well known or well told, but I hope that through trying to draw them out this year, we've helped to bring some of them to the fore a bit more, and also to look at some of the parallels and changes that we see in the sort of modern world of work and the modern trade union movement. So, you know, we are now a 50-50 male and female union movement. Women are more likely to be union members than men. We've got our first woman General Secretary of the TUC in Frances O'Grady. And some of the issues that we're campaigning on are very different to those that those sort of founding women faced. But actually a lot of them in their roots have some of the same kind of origins in terms of experiencing injustice together and getting together to listen, understand one another's perspectives and work out the best way to make positive change. And there are brilliant young women all over the place doing that in companies like TGI Fridays that took strike action over tips a couple of weeks ago and have been running an absolutely brilliant campaign against all of the odds. So there are real kind of fantastic stories of leadership now that I hope we can kind of bring out in our discussion in talking about the world of work.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much. Yvette, can I turn to you and can you introduce yourself and also talk about your perspective on leadership?
Okay, right. And I'd like to really thank you for inviting me today as well. I'm not a great public speaker, I've been thrown into it, so bear with me, but I'll be watching for anyone sleeping at the back. I'll test you. So I currently am one of the 5 women who run the Justice for Grenfell campaign in my local area. I have originally a community background, and that was mainly in the anti-racist movement and around developing kind of good community race relations in Notting Hill, where I live. I was part of many campaigns over a long time. After the Stephen Lawrence campaign, I then went to become a civil servant for 15 years. I left in 2016. I went into the Crown Prosecution Service to help write their hate crime prosecution policy and was in a fairly senior role in there. The fact that when I actually leave, I'm placed in the Violence Against Women and Girls unit, because if you understand race, you understand women, was quite fascinating for me that analogy could be drawn. And it was because I was dealing with kind of the treatment of victims and witnesses, I almost felt that I was kind of being put into this caring, understanding role, as opposed to the policy role that I had gone in there to write. My perspective on leadership, I felt in the anti-racist movement, and I think I blame myself for some of that. So as a woman, I became the organiser in the background, and that was about me telling myself that I didn't want kind of a frontline role. So I was kind of happy to potter about. But actually, the men that I worked with were quite happy for me to be there. So, you know, I'd write their speeches for them, I'd tell them what to say, I'd do all their research for them. And looking back now, I realise that it was, although it was about race, it was still very gendered. We also went on to found Operation Black Vote. And one of the things that we looked at around that was women's participation, black women's participation in public life and how they were very kind of invisible from that. And just having to say, you know, this isn't just a race thing. Do you know what I mean? Our intersectionality in terms of gender also matters, and our experience is different to yours. For me as a black female, I've never really connected with the, you know, kind of feminine call for being in a boardroom or, you know, joining one of the FTSE 100 companies. I didn't see that as leadership. I saw many leaders in the community where I kind of worked, where, you know, women who were often kind of celebrated, but it was always kind of almost small scale, like, oh, you know, look at this lovely lady running a youth project for the local community. Whereas actually this woman's an entrepreneur and a businesswoman, but you don't explain her role in those terms, so you keep it gendered as you go along. I think that there is something about redefining what female leadership means. And I think if we don't kind of redefine that, we will stay confined in us being pushed in kind of the same kind of silos that they assume male leadership is. And I'm going to say, for me as a black female, I look at women who have gone into what we would call formal kind of leadership roles. And for me, Diane Abbott stands out. She's the first female black MP, but she's constantly vilified for that, more than anyone else, kind of, who has kind of got to that role. And I think unless we redefine that for the next generation, you will find that people will step back more and not want to be part of that kind of formal leadership thing, because, you know, we're all human after all. So,
Yvette, can you just tell us what propelled you from being the organiser in the back who was making everything happen while others were on the stage to the kind of leadership that you're engaged in today?
I think standing at the foot of Grenfell Tower and watching it burn. I stood out there in the night with my 10-year-old daughter, and when I looked at that, it just told me everything that was wrong with the society that we lived in. And also, if you look at the 72 victims who lost their lives at Grenfell, the majority of them are women and children. So I was just forced to talk. I couldn't stay silent any longer.
And in your different experiences of leadership, the trade union movement, obviously, by history, by definition, it's a structure, it's an organisation, there are votes, people get to the top of it, people ultimately emerge as the national trade union leader. And you've shown leadership in all different sorts of settings, including in the civil service, but now in this very community-oriented campaign. How do you view women's roles in those two structures? Some would say that women do leadership differently. Even in a very hierarchical structure, women do leadership differently. Others would say it's not so much that there are inherent differences between male and female leadership styles. It's not sort of in us. It's that, you know, we've been through a gendered experience as we've grown, and so characteristics like empathy and consultation and listening to people and not being the bossy one are characteristics that we've absorbed. You know, what's your perspective on that?
And I think I did a sociology degree, so my lecturers would kill me if I said anything other than what I genuinely believe, which is that these behaviours are socially conditioned through what society expects of us, and through the kind of constructs and lenses through which people view male and female leaders. And I think, of course, that's not to deny that there are different kind of tendencies and can be different strengths, but I think those are often really overstated in quite an essentialist way, with a kind of stereotype over here of the kind of heroic
charismatic male leader, and the stereotype here of the consensus building, intuitive, conflict averse woman, and actually individual leadership styles vary incredibly. But I think perhaps responses to leadership styles are very gendered and can kind of reinforce some of those expectations about how people behave, and that's actually, of course, incredibly disempowering and limiting for women. I think it's actually quite disempowering and limiting for men as well, in reinforcing that to be seen as a successful leader, they need to follow a kind of particular way of leading.
And Yvette, what's your view on that?
I think for me, on the current campaign, the lens is often that they think we're running a donation and relief centre, not a political campaign.
Yes.
So people will ring up and say, you know, are you taking any more donations? Where can we send donations to? And we're just like, we're trying to run a serious political campaign here. Can you try that number? And that is solely because it is a female that usually picks up the phone.
Yeah.
So yeah, clearly gendered. Or they'll ask for the boss.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting sort of duality there, which I think we need to bring out. It's that when leadership is stereotyped, it can create a very narrow path for leaders. So if for female leaders, and I think your point is male leaders too. So when leadership is stereotyped, for example, as a former Prime Minister, you know, how did you show strength without it being characterised as, you know, raw aggression, you know, anger as hysteria, those sorts of things. So it's limiting in terms of the behaviours that women can show as leaders. But your point is a very important one, and an even more subtle one in many ways, which is that because women are leaders, people then default to thinking they're leading a campaign with empathy at its core, rather than leading a campaign with political muscle at its core, and that is the campaign you want to lead. You and I had a very interesting conversation about how that's played out, that you know, you must be leading a campaign with empathy at the core as you've intersected with the power structures like parliamentary committees. Can you just talk to us a bit about that?
So I was sharing with Julia the other day, we had a meeting with one of the ministers, I'll keep him nameless. So I went there, I'm with two members of bereaved families. So I've asked him for 2 amendments to 2 pieces of legislation and 2 things that he can do at a local authority level to start building up trust and confidence. He clearly hadn't checked out who I was. He just thought, oh, you know, the little girl running down Ladbroke Grove. So he then said to me, oh, you know, well, what evidence do you have that these will work? So I said, because I've tried and tested it in CPS for 15 years. So one of his officers then said, are you the Yvette Williams from CPS? And I'm just like, same one. So he started saying, this woman bought the CPS from nothing to up here, blah, 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 blah. So we then start a serious discussion. So I broke down the legislation that I want him to change, etc., etc. And I think that he's taken it on board. So when we're leaving, he walks us to the lift and he says to me, I feel like giving you a hug. And I was just like, I've just spoken to you as an equal, telling you how you need to change the law to make this a better society. And you finish it off with, can I give you a hug? I'm with 2 bereaved family members. I think they need a hug more than I do. And it really stuck with me. I was fuming. I was just like, how dare he do that? And he didn't even look embarrassed.
It's a great story. Names have been suppressed,
to protect the guilty.
Yeah, not the innocent on this occasion, but a great story about, you know, even when you are in a circumstance where your leadership has become credentialed through the reference to your civil service career and your own engagement, it's sort of defaulted to gender. It's a great example. Alice, in your journey in the trade union movement and the things you've done before, the local government association, do you see now, still feel that there are times where women in the movement are pigeonholed into this sort of female leadership role, or, you know, female set of characteristics? Or do you, think the sort of, because the trade union movement has a progressive outlook, it has more absorbed many of these lessons compared with other parts of British society?
I think there are some interesting echoes actually with some of these points about kind of perceptions of work that is done by women and roles that are held by women, because we do an equality audit of our unions to find out what they're working on and what they're doing within their own structures every couple of years. And one of the questions we ask them is about who are your reps. And we know that in certain sort of workplace rep roles, despite the fact that membership is now about 50-50, men are more likely to hold the sort of health and safety rep role, the shop steward. Women are more likely to be equality reps, learning reps. But actually, the role of the learning rep is incredibly powerful, and it's through workplace learning supported by trade unions that an awful lot of women and men have a really kind of transformational experience and come into leadership through kind of finding, confidence, training, education, and it's women who are leading that and taking on those roles. So it perhaps speaks to that point about perceptions of roles.
Yes, and so there's I guess there's a cycle, isn't there? The role is perceived of lesser status, and so women more likely to do it, which then leads to the further perception that it's a role of lesser status, despite the fact, and as you've put about community organising and people who put in the sort of do-gooder category, whereas they could easily be put in the entrepreneurship, running a business, innovating category, that the very language we use and how it relates to gender ends up shaping perceptions. The threads of this are also intersected. How do we unpack it for the future and for change? Yes, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're obviously on a journey to say, if you come in to politics, to a for-profit corporation, to any organisation in our society, and you aspire to be the leader in that formal structure, there should be no additional barriers in your way of perception or organisational barriers. How time at work is valued for being promoted, for example, which can be the kind of thing that plays against women if they have family responsibilities. So we're on that journey. But there's a set of other things here that clearly need to change. What else would you add to that agenda? So the beyond the hierarchy agenda.
I think there's some minimum things that, although they're minute, they still kind of send out a really powerful message. And a good piece of advice that somebody gave me a while back was, they said, when you go into a room and there are more men than women, never offer to make the tea. Never offer to make the tea. And when you go in there and you sit down, they feel uncomfortable, because I'm just looking at my nails like. The other one is, who's going to take the minutes? We've all been there. More of us need to kind of like buy out of that, because that's just kind of the foundations for the greater things that kind of, as you do go up that leadership pole, if you haven't got rid of those, do you know what I mean? They're going to take you down a completely different realm. By the time you do get to the top, do you know what I mean? You're in a very gendered fixed position that is so difficult to get out of, because those basic minimums are still normal practice today.
That's very true. Now, I see out of the corner of my eye we have been joined by Jess Phillips. So, Jess, please, if you'd like to join us on stage.
Sorry I was late. Democracy. That's all I can say to that.
What democratic blow has been struck this evening?
Well, none, because we lost the vote, but they insisted that I stayed. It was about universal credit and social care funding. I'm afraid we're as in a bad a situation as we were this morning.
Right. Okay, but we do understand why you needed to stay for that vote.
Apologise.
So thank you for joining us, Jess. You've missed the opening, and what we did at the opening is we Yvette and Alice both introduced themselves and their perception of this issue of what it is to be a leader, what it is to be a female leader, women's leadership. So can I throw that open to you?
I'm a bit hot. So, to me, I'm Jess Phillips. I'm the Labour MP for Birmingham Yardley and the chair of the Women's Parliamentary Labour Party. To me, I think that women's leadership, the idea of women's leadership needs turning on its head a little bit. I don't know what you've all said, so I might just entirely repeat what you've said. Honestly, I didn't copy. I think that it needs turning on its head for all sorts of different intersecting reasons. But to me, one of the main reasons I think that we've got the wrong idea of what leadership is around class, the issue of class. And the women I see where I live are acting with huge sense of leadership in the communities all across the United Kingdom, and I imagine all across the world, is that women are often the people who take positions, who will think of something in their local community and get it done, and yet we never ourselves think of that as leadership. We just think of it as the lives that we lead. That the idea is that, oh, that's just what we do. Of course, we make sure that everything runs well in our local community. Of course, if something's going to shut where we live, we make sure that it's not going to shut, or we make sure that something gets opened. And because when we close our eyes, we think of people making decisions. We don't think of people who look like us and are doing exactly what we are doing to keep the country running. We ourselves don't think of ourselves as leaders, even though we are changing people's lives every single day on every single street, certainly in Birmingham, in the UK, and I'm sure across the world. And we need to stop thinking of leadership as being man in suit at lectern, giving or walking around as if you're Elon Musk, pacing up and down with your big ideas, because actually leadership is about getting people to follow you, and I think women are considerably better at that. It was the Elon Musk bashing, I think, that people liked. He's not popular.
What, you don't want to go to Mars? You probably want to see him build some Teslas first, I suspect. Just, you have joined perfectly to the conversation, because we were trying to tease out these threads about the way we see leadership, the fact that when things are done by women, they're viewed as a lesser status, the fact that when a woman does something, she's seen to be leading from a place of empathy rather than potentially from other motivations, running, a hard-hitting political campaign, running fairness and justice agendas in the workplace. So just building on what you've said, how do we change the perception of leadership? How do we reframe this so that a woman in your community who is doing a powerful thing that is changing the community for the better is viewed as a leader?
I think it is incredibly difficult, and basically the patriarchy stops us from thinking that. I have met lots of the women who ran the repeal campaign in Ireland, arguably the only progressive thing that has happened in the past 5 years. And these women did it entirely from a grassroots perspective. They got out there and they talked to people, and they ran a campaign and they won it resoundingly. And they did it all by stopping some of the stuff that you see on all the stuff around internet persuasion in elections. They managed to overarch that. They got through all of that. They changed the way that things would be seen. These women, if they were men and had run this successful campaign, would be on the front of Time magazine. They all are part-time workers and part-time campaigners, full-time workers. Not one of them has been rung by, you know, Clinton's people or, you know, nobody is bothering with these women because they just did this thing. And how we change seeing those women as the future of political campaigning, which they absolutely are, is incredibly difficult while we still have the tight jacket of all of our own ideas about what leadership in politics looks like, what leadership in campaigning, what leadership in business looks like. How we change that is incredibly difficult because we ourselves fall for it. I myself fall for it all the time. And that is patriarchal structures. And so to change that is about changing everything about women's life. And it's not what you asked for, it's going to take forever, sorry. Is that we have to change all sorts of different things before all of us can see that as leadership. How those women aren't on the front of every single magazine or the entire world over, I have absolutely no idea, because they sidestepped Putin. You know, they sidestepped Russian intervention, and they sidestepped all sorts of other issues that no other political campaign has managed for ages. And we're not asking them any questions because we don't consider them to be leaders. We just think that they're good women who just did a good thing. So how we change that, I wish I had the answer. I think we need to change women. It's liberation of women. Patriarchal structures stop us from being able to see them in that light. Sorry, that's not the answer you want.
No, no, that's a very, it's a very good answer, because it's a challenge to all of us as to how we frame our own thinking, and if we can reframe our own thinking, how we surface the stories, how we tell the stories, which really, and you missed this, but Alice at the start was talking about the 150-year anniversary in the trade union movement and the surfacing of the stories of women's leadership in early trade unionism, which haven't been told. So how do we surface the stories? Yvette was talking about how within campaigns, you know, women can stereotype or be stereotyped by the roles they take, by wanting to get in there and do things, but then becoming the minute taker and the helper rather than viewed as the leader. So all of that, I think, joins together well. But I just want to flip it a little bit now, which is perhaps as we think about this reframing, we do have to ask ourselves the question, given how women leaders are received today, and given the way we know that women's leadership is evaluated through the perceptions of gender, we know that women leaders receive a lot more criticism and abuse than male leaders. Would we actually be helping women by reframing what they're doing as a leading role, or is that making them more of a target? I mean, I think you've had some experience. You know, we were talking before about Yvette being in a number of campaigns where she was the organiser, but not on the stage doing the advocacy. Now she's clearly at the forefront doing the advocacy. What's the price to be paid for that?
I mean, I don't know if it's personal, but I mean, obviously I get nervous at times. You know, phone clicks a few times too. I think, yeah, too many. I think there are some kind of choices that you feel you have to make that you don't feel comfortable with, and that's kind of around, you know, time with your family, that kind of stuff. So kind of, you know, am I being a good partner, a mother? What is, you know, how do people kind of view that? What are the sacrifices that I'm willing to make around that? And almost that, am I being chosen to take a male role because that's what because how people view me as a female is still very important to me. I want my lens to be feminine. And is that part and parcel of people then not seeing you as a leader? Because there's still those so-called stereotypical masculine traits around leadership roles.
Just explain that to me when you say you still want your lens to be feminine. Just can you unpack that a little bit?
I still want to be seen as, you know, a good mother, you know, running a good home, those kind of things. I don't want those to be taken away from me
Some of us
because
never
they're
had them.
seen as, yeah.
I never ran a good home. I'm not a great mum.
I'm catching up with you on that one. But I don't want, that's who I am.
You want to be
And it's
received
one
as
of
a
the-
whole human
Yeah,
being.
I want to be I want it all. I want the package. I want it all.
Good for you.
And in the trade union movement, you know, it is, I mean, I'm sure there is more of a price to be paid by women leaders. I mean, the first woman to be General Secretary, is there more of a price being paid by her than men have historically worn in that role, which is always going to be, you know, it's never going to be an easy role. It's always going to be a controversial role. You don't become a leader of the trade union movement without knowing how to, you know, put arguments with some force and to win through, even in the face of what can seem overwhelming odds. But is there an extra bit because of gender?
I think there's something about the kind of, like, the people that you surround yourself with, and in terms of Frances O'Grady as General Secretary of the TUC, like, she has, I'd kind of want to ask her directly about whether she felt that the level of the perception of her role as General Secretary has been different as a woman. I know that there was a huge amount of interest when she was appointed in the fact that she was a woman, and actually she's got a really strong story to tell about her, you know, her achievements as a campaigner, her career, and there was a point at which, you know, she was really proud. We were really proud to have her as our first woman General Secretary, but there was a point at which not many of the newspaper articles could kind of get beyond that and tell the story of, here is a formidable campaigner with a long track record. But, you know, I think she's telling that story now, and she's kind of thinking about my own experience. Kind of, there are all of these brilliant women around who, I think part of it is, and this goes partly to what Yvette was saying, was kind of when you have these experiences and think, I feel like there's something sexist happening here. Is that just me? And knowing that you've got trusted women around you that you can turn to and say, is that what's really happening here? And, you know, we've got those kind of networks, and they really help, because you've got that kind of reality check of, this feels like this is what's happening, am I right? And I think that goes in any field.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I do feel that I need to say proudly for my country at this moment that we are, I think, on our fourth female trade union leader. Yes, Jenny George, Sharon Burrow, Jed Carney, and now Sally McManus. So.
And Sharon Burrow, now leader of the International Congress of Trade Unions as well. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. One for the Aussies. Jess, you've written a whole book on this topic, Every Woman, One Woman's Truth About Speaking the Truth. Your perspective on the price that can be paid for being a leader, as you are.
The price it can be huge, and you can pay the ultimate price, in fact, and there is a very real and growing trend around the security of specifically women in politics. There is a big piece of research and piece of work being done by an organisation called Not the Cost out of Washington that tries to track all of the violence faced by women in political leadership. And of course, one of my best friends lost her life. And certainly I myself have faced, as I'm sure you have, Julia, the death threats and threats against my family and threats to my security. And of course, any political leader, especially when you reach the very top, is going to face security threats. That is a sad given, but we've already baked that into our democracy. That's a given, that's the case. But what we are currently baking in is the idea that women politicians, one of the things that you're going to have to put up with if you take on a leadership role in politics and in the public eye, is that you are going to face violence, and that is certainly not the same for my male colleagues. We have
I think even if the level of threats are the same, the threats in themselves tend to be gendered, like threatening rape and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, and they tend, because of often the sexual or sexist element to it, the violence ramps up with that, the threat of violence. But I mean, in Parliament now, those the greatest threat tend to be women on the left in the north and the Midlands, and that is because they are more likely to be stridently speaking with a certain perspective, usually feminist or egalitarian or anti-racist. Certainly in Jo's case, it was anti-racism that meant she paid the ultimate price. And I never ever want to put people off taking a leadership role when we talk about the violence that we face and how it is worsening. But unless we talk about it, we have got to stop accepting it as a baked-in part of our democracy, because it is pernicious and it is definitely putting people off. A young councillor in the next seat to mine just put on Twitter that she'd had an email that said she's in a sort of 90% Kashmiri Bangladeshi ward that she represents, and she's a young white woman, single mom, and she had a thing that said, "You are a traitor to your race. You will pay the ultimate price." And that was just, and she's a councillor. I mean, it's not like, you know, and she was this woman I'm talking about, this working class woman who just went out in her community and did something good, and people said, "Oh, do you know what? You should be our leader because you're a good egg." And this is the price she is now paying for that. And it is worse. There have been many white men who stood in the same seat who never received the same criticism. But we have to keep talking about it. And it's definitely, in Parliament, it is definitely worse for women politicians, the level of threat than we face for men. But that is because we are showing leadership, and it is being recognised as leadership, and it must be stopped.
And what has the reaction been to you putting all that out there as clearly as you did? I mean, it was reported around the world.
Actually, it's really easy to hear criticism, isn't it? And not so easy to hear love and affection. It has been I get hundreds of emails every week or messages on Twitter and Facebook of women empowered by people like me speaking up on that sort of thing and sending love, and I get a lot of cat pictures.
Do you like cats?
Yeah, no, I actually wrote in my book, please, if you see someone being horrible to me, send me cat pictures. I don't even really like cats, but it's just like an internet meme anyway. I much prefer dogs.
Right, you heard it here first. Send dog pictures.
That's like 48% like dogs, 52% like cats. But the backlash is, of course, to belittle it. The patriarchal powers and power structures and established power structures will always try to undermine testimony like mine in order to remain powerful. And I think that I feel like feminists have got to have the job of making sure men feel all right with us having a little bit of power. And it's not really our job, it should be theirs. But it turns out they're rubbish at doing that job, so we're just going to have to do it anyway, pretty much like all jobs. I do feel like sometimes that maybe some of the backlash to our backlash, to a feminist backlash, to women actually making some gains, that some people feel incredibly threatened by that, and that conversation potentially needs to be had, although I would struggle not to roll my eyes. But the reaction very often is to try and belittle you further and say, oh, you're not tough enough. You're not tough enough to take 600 rape threats. You should be tougher. You should be tough enough to, you know, have people mock up pictures of your children hanging, that sort of thing. It's pretty, you know, it's not. And then people say, well, it's not. You're not fit for politics if you can't hack that. It's pretty grim. But don't worry, we'll keep going. I realised it was a bit of a downer.
Well, I am going to throw it open to the audience now for some questions. And before we conclude, we are going to have some positive reflections on where to next. But problems do get solved by talking about them. So it is important to be frank about the dimensions of the problems. I'm going to take questions. We've got microphones, so I'll sort of take a few as I see them. Yes, here. And then we'll just come to this side here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Emma Taggart. I help introverts succeed as leaders.
You might just need to hold that little closer.
Whatever you said.
Can you hear now?
Yeah, that's a bit better.
I said I'm Emma Taggart and I help introverts succeed as leaders. What I wanted to ask you about was that obviously there are factors that intersect with gender that make it more difficult for women to be taken seriously as leaders. And we've quite rightly talked about race and we've talked about class. A third factor is introversion. And so, you know, if we think about the traditional idea of a leader, it's usually a white, middle-class, you know, very gregarious man. And yeah, that's not an introvert, basically. So I wondered if the panel agreed that women face this extra barrier of introversion to be taken seriously as a leader. And if you do agree, what can we do about it?
Okay, thank you. Great question. And we're going to take the two questions here. Thank you, Gemma.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Paul. I'm a researcher into girls and leadership at the moment and a Labour councillor, and I recognise everything you've said. And I do not know a city councillor who hasn't had any kind of threat. Sorry, just parking that. I've just finished a pilot of a study where I've been asking 12 to 14-year-old girls the length and breadth of the country about their perception of women in public leadership roles. And it's been quite heartbreaking, first of all, to agree with what Yvette said. If you ask them if you've got any leadership experience, they all say no. If you ask them if they're in charge of anything, if they have any responsibility, they have loads. What they do is never recognised as building any kind of capacity. When you're talking about, you know, the myth is that girls want to be celebrities, actually they recognise really early that that is a really poisoned chalice. And my favourite quotation from the data at the moment is saying, would you want to do this? They look at you with horror and say, well, why would you want to? Why would a girl now, looking at what happens on social media, in mainstream media as well, the way women are treated, what do we say to the 12-year-old when we're saying, you know, we need you to be a leader? And she says, why would I want to?
And just in front of you, if you hand the microphone, thank you.
Hi, Virginia Crosby, Director of Women to Win. There's a couple of things I wanted to explore. One of them is the women actually supporting other women, so the sisterhood and the whole, you know, there's a special place in hell for women that don't support other women, from Madeleine Albright. And the second one was women don't seem to be as good as networking as the men. So I just think by default, it's perhaps more of a lonely place. And I know when I was in the financial sector, I didn't want to go out in the evenings drinking, meeting lots of people. I wanted to actually go home and be with my kids. But does that put us in a different situation to the men?
Okay, three good questions. I'm happy to take any reflections.
On the introversion, can I talk to you? But I think it's such an interesting perspective on this, and I think incredibly valuable, and perhaps speaks to that point that we were exploring right at the beginning about kind of valuing and recognising different styles of leadership and making space for them, because these kind of very narrow perceptions are limiting for what leadership constitutes, are limiting for everyone. And I think the upshot of them is that perhaps we don't get the kind of diversity and range and quality of leadership that we need. So as to whether introversion is kind of an additional factor for women in particular, I think that's partly speaks to some of the challenges around the kind of expectations of how women conduct themselves in leadership roles. And those kind of limitations that are placed on us from the outside as much as by our own sense of our own kind of ability to lead.
I think there's still something about that mansplaining thing that goes on. That, you know, you say something and then you're ignored. 15 minutes later, somebody down the table says it happens to be a man, and then just, oh, it's a really good idea. Let's go with it, you know. So I think that can make us appear to be more introverted, but actually it's because...
Can't hear us like a dog whistle.
Yeah, no one's listening. Yeah, so I think that's the thing. The point about young girls, I've got a daughter who's 11, and she's just kind of getting to the stage where she's getting a bit kind of not sure about what roles are, and that's because she started secondary school. So in our house, my partner cooks. And she's come home the other day saying, you know, why don't we have an au pair that cooks?
What? Where do you live?
And I'm like, because we don't have an au pair. Talk to your dad. He's the au pair here. And I know she hasn't learned that in the home, but she's learning that from her peers. She has no idea about kind of what feminine and masculine is. She's only just started to do that because she's learning German. And she kind of said to me, what's the feminine and the masculine kind of thing? And I think if you asked her who was the leader in the house, she would say me. She just would. It's just part of her world. So it's kind of, how do we expand that on a national level? You know, why is our education system failing that in some kind of way? You know, how gendered is our curriculum still? You know, are we looking at the images that are coming out in the media? And we cannot control social media. But I think, you know, what are the things that the state is responsible for that our children have access to that can change and become ungendered? Because they're saying that they're doing it, but if we're getting girls at 12 to 14 still kind of having a fixed view on what gender roles is, then that tells me nothing's changed.
And it starts so young, doesn't it? Like my sort of equivalent story is my daughter's just started school in September. I've got her first parents' evening on Friday. Her pool teacher is like lovely, great teacher, quite new, and I'm building up to a conversation with him about gendered language with the kids, because he uses affectionate terms with the children, and he calls the girls sweetie and the boys buddy, and it's these tiny little seeds. I don't mind, call them anything, but call them the same.
Yeah.
And the affection's lovely, but it just these tiny seeds about, okay, what's expected of me is to be sweet and caring and gentle, and what's expected of the others is to be matey, and they're going to be friends, and they're going to be equals. And actually the teaching unions have done some brilliant stuff around
really
this.
Recently,
the NUT that's now part of the NEU's done a fantastic campaign called Breaking the Mould that's about early years, from nursery and reception, and getting at some of breaking down these stereotypes that can be introduced so early.
I was even thinking about sports, so we're seeing more women commentators, but actually we still have women's football, men's football, and you're just like, football's football. If you're good at playing football, join a football team.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
and you know, women's football is the softer sport.
We're much better at it in this country.
Yeah.
Women are much better than the men. Surprise. My son saw a headline once that said Tory MP's son attacked in KFC, and he said to me, do you know this man, Mummy? And I read the newspaper article, and it was a story about a woman MP. My son, the only MP he knows, is a woman, and the headline is literally about him, apart from Tory. MP's son is him, and he still thought it was a man when he looked at that headline. And he's been raised in my house. So we have a long way to go before we stop this gendering of jobs and gendering of ideas. My other son in hospital thought a woman was a nurse, not a doctor, and they live with me. So this, you know, it's pernicious. I can't answer a question about what it's like to be an introvert. People always say to me, do you hate the barracking in the House of Commons? Is it really masculine? And I'm like that. No. But the question about networks, again, I think we need to turn this on its head. Our idea of like men playing golf and going down the pub and make it sort of like beer and sandwiches of the trade union movement, like whether that still exists anymore, I haven't got a clue because I'm not interested in taking part in it. There is an awful lot of networks that build up, but women build up much, much better networks. We are much, much better at networking in reality. We just don't value those networks. If you ask any woman to name 10 women who had done something that meant that they could have had their job, go to work, get up in the morning, they would all be able to name 10 women. I asked a load of women to do this, and some of the women who came back to me, it was on Facebook, told me things that I had done that helped them get a job, that helped them do, just get up in the morning, deal with their lives. And I never thought of it as doing anything. I was like, that was nothing. I just put out some bin bags outside your house. I cooked you a dinner. I didn't think anything of it. But we are amazing. My husband, he couldn't organise, it's his 40th birthday at the weekend, he couldn't organise to go to the pub. It's literally that rubbish at building networks. I have had to do that for him. I think that once again, we don't value the networks that women create and that women do. But I think that women helping other women is absolutely the only way, because you will be driven mad, as you said, if you don't have people around you where you can go, that did just happen, didn't it? Did I just imagine that? It's the only way we're going to do it. And in the workplace and in trying to get leadership positions, it's really good to have another woman where you work as an ally. And it's what Women to Win is entirely based on, and is a brilliant organisation. But it's much easier as a woman to speak up for somebody else, and so find those allies at work and get other people speaking up for you.
As we go out for some more questions, I can share one optimistic story on this perception of stereotypes. When I was Australian Prime Minister, a friend of mine was talking to her young son, he was about 5 or 6, and something had happened in politics which had caught his attention on the news, and so she was trying to explain this political issue to him in terms that he would understand, and culminated the explanation by saying to him, if you're really interested in things like this, when you grow up, you could be Prime Minister. To which he knowingly replied, no, Mummy, you've got to be a girl to do that. It can happen. Now, I saw some hands here. Oh, heavens, many, many hands. We'll do our best. So we'll bring a swing, maybe a swing along the front here. And then we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Jamie Roberts from the Political Studies Association. So it's so great to hear, the different organisations that people work for and, fantastic work being done by women. And it's like we struggle to get into these leadership positions and we're still thinking that we're not good enough. How do we get past this imposter syndrome, I guess? We've made it, but you're still comparing yourself to other people and you're still not valuing your work. So just your opinions on that.
Thank you. Now, can you just hand the microphone back and then we'll bring it forward again and come down the front.
Hi, my name is Catherine Coates. I'm a structural engineer. We've heard about women's networks and I completely agree with that. But I'm also very interested in how we work with men to improve women's experience of leadership or getting to leadership. And I think I'm very interested in concrete things that, everyone can do together, because there are more men in power. So, basically, we kind of, I think it's the right thing to do to be inclusive of men in this journey, but also practically, it's pretty vital.
Can you hand the mic forward? Forward, and there was a hand here, yes.
Irma Kruijf. I have 4 daughters and I really worry about them, and I actually was going to say the thing about the men. How can we engage with the men? Because we should leverage the men that are supportive, I think. To me, I do the women's organisation in my bank, and actually we are at stage 2 where we can't keep circling around the same people discussing how we can become more confident and what can we do and how can we support you to move forward. We actually need to engage with the enemy, if you will. So, and I think, you know, I really think this is a wonderful forum to put together. I've certainly told my daughters I'm here tonight to speak up and to be heard, and I go out and do that because I think it's really important we talk about these things. But I do think the men engagement is really important across, you know, the men, other colours, other greeds, other all kinds. We all need to work together to make this happen because we can't really do it by ourselves.
Thank you. Now, there was a hand here, so we'll just go sweep across the front and grab you. Thank you.
I work in the violence against women sector, and what Yvette said about that sense of those nice, kind women doing something good for their community, it really resonated with me. And when you've got, I mean, despite the fact it's a deeply political sector, when you've got the mostly male purse string holders able to kind of paint you like that and say, we can kind of keep cutting and these kind people will keep filling the gaps, you become kind of complicit because you can't not, because then your services are going to close. How do you kind of get yourself, how do we get ourselves out of that fix when there is so much work to be done?
Okay, we're going to do a really quick swing and then go back for some more questions, which will, I think, I've got this watch, you can go to Mars, you can't tell the time on it. Then we'll have to start.
Must make it.
Sorry? You do, no, that's right. Not brought to me by Elon Musk. So men on the journey, imposter syndrome, filling in the gaps, working to the stereotypes of, yes, these good women will do it, and therefore you end up kind of complicit in the rollback, cutback agenda. Would people like to just take a bite at one of those? Or? Yes.
So in terms of kind of men on the journey, I think I don't want to completely lose sight of the role of policy and public policy in some of this, because looking at the gender pay gap stats that came out earlier this year, you know, what sits under that? Well, it's pay discrimination, it's still out there. It's segregation in terms of the kind of work that women and men do. And it's about kind of lack of flexible working, and what sits behind that is about an unequal sharing of caring responsibilities, and women still kind of bearing so much of the load of the kind of domestic labour alongside. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the need to make really practical, concrete changes in terms of making flexible working the norm for women and for men. And not only something that is seen as the woman who'll kind of take a step back when a family has children, but that it's something that you can kind of, where there's an expectation that that will be acceptable for both of you to make those moves and to share that load. And yes, you need other solutions around it, like good quality childcare and better paternity leave and shared parental leave and so on. But I'm just kind of, I think that's got to play a part in the jigsaw of all of this.
Sure.
When men do it, it's acceptable.
Well, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's, yeah, it's,
Against too, but I've seen that sometimes if a man in a very secure position, my husband was the first person to start working part-time in the history of his department in Imperial College, and he got a lot of flack for it, but he was in a secure position, and he could do it.
Yes. Yeah.
And now the post office started doing it.
Yeah, and the you know, the evidence is very clear about you know, if flexibilities are only used by women, then there is a penalty to be paid for using those flexibilities. Where if you can normalise, you know, that they're commonly used, men, women generally use, then it's different. But we had the men, the imposters, the gap filling.
Becoming the gap filler. I mean, I became the gap filler. I did exactly as you did. I would just say, yeah, you can. I remember a particular contract that I used to run when I worked at Women's Aid, where there was a perpetrator scheme that was set up, and there was £250,000 given to 100 perpetrators over a year, and to deal with the same women, because it wouldn't be safe unless you had the women catered for by a women's aid organisation, we were given £18,000 to work with 100 women and their children. So it is completely sexist commissioning, but they knew that we would do it because it wouldn't be safe for those women if they set up the scheme without it. So we just said, yes, okay, we'll do it for a fraction of the cost. We'll do more work than the people doing the perpetrator scheme for a fraction of the cost because it won't be safe and women will die. And it's very, very easy to take advantage of that. And it is the single reason why I then became a local councillor, so I could be in charge of the commissioning decisions. And then when I got to the top of that level and was like, I tried to make the best commissioning decisions, but with the money that we had, I was like, right then, we have to go to the next level and make the law now about those commissioning decisions. And the women's movement has always been about that. If it isn't about just a group of women who put a mattress on the floor in a squat, to try and fill a gap because no one else is doing it. We shouldn't ever lose that, and we shouldn't allow that kindness, that brilliance of the women's movement that was a dirty mattress in a squat, be taken away by bureaucracy and having to fill in forms. We will lose some of it. So I don't want to criticise that element of the kind women doing the kind thing, because when we lose it, we'll never get it back. But at the same time, the whole point of the entire structure of the women's movement, since the beginning of time, it has been about gaining power so that those decisions didn't just happen. And the only way we can do that is if we fight politically for political power to change those things, and we get women out campaigning not to vote for the things that we wouldn't want to see. So we won't just take it. We'll take it because to make it safe because we're kind, but then we'll fight back. It's the only answer that we have to that problem.
Yeah, I just think the way the state has struggled for years to understand the impacts of violence against women and young girls, they just simply don't care.
They don't care.
They don't. It doesn't benefit them in any way. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't promote their position or leadership in any way. It's not a threat to their leadership in any way. And I'll give you an example. So the Home Office has the most brilliant violence against women and girls strategy that's been being developed for years. I mean, the fact that it's only 3 years ago they start to begin to understand kind of controlling and coercive behaviour is kind of really telling of them, seeing as they've been controlling and coercing everybody for centuries.
The Home Office
do you know
could
what I mean?
definitely be
It's
taken
kind
to
of,
court on that ground.
do you know what I mean? It's the basis of colonialism. Do you know what I mean? An empire.
I think that's
Why
an entirely
don't you
different
get
debate,
it?
but we could definitely have
So you're being ignorant. But on the night of Grenfell, we had 2 women who had previously reported domestic violence housed in a hotel room with the perpetrator. So no strategy, gone. In terms of the imposter syndrome, I get that a lot. And my campaign colleagues tell me, just wing it. Men have been winging it for centuries, just wing it. It's okay to be an imposter, just wing it.
Everybody is making it up.
Everybody's making it up as you go along.
Is making it up.
Yeah.
If you want to challenge your imposter syndrome, spend an afternoon in the House of
Hogwarts, my
Okay,
MP
we're going
calls
to
it.
go out for the last few questions. I know I'm going to make a few people very unhappy here. You've got the microphone, so we might just go
the
1,
aisle.
2, 3. And then I am going to cut it off there and just swing over and get a few on the side, otherwise it would be unfair. So I'll come over here to you two. So please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Phoebe Price and I work in the civil service at the moment. And I've just graduated from university, and in my degree I studied a lot about refugees' experiences and refugee women who had amazing leadership capabilities but who couldn't go into leadership positions because they'd work very long hours, low-paid jobs, and often leadership opportunities and leadership schemes, like you said earlier, to get women into the boardroom or focused at women who are in jobs where there are leadership opportunities to encourage them to take it. So my question is, what can we do to elevate women who perhaps aren't noticed by these leadership schemes, or it's harder to get them into leadership into leadership positions where they can make changes, for example, in policies regarding refugees, and like you said, to make the Home Office care about women who've had violence against them. We need those voices in those leadership positions. So how can we go about elevating them?
Thank you. And then I took the two behind. Yes? I went 1, 2, 3, so please, yes.
I'm so glad you spoke to me, because I think I'm one of the few people with a suntan in the room. And why I wanted to speak is that I think intersectionality is very important in this debate. Feeling privileged, I mean, I'm British born, went to school here and everything, but I have a strong cultural African heritage where there are matrilineal links. And women have power, and you see women have power, and men also respect women and give them that sense of power. And that's where I come to the intersectionality element. Forgive me, but in 1911, there was the first Congress, Worldwide Congress on Racism, attended by 2,100 delegates. And one of the organizers and supporters was a feminist, was black from Africa, and was my great-grandfather. Yeah. So I've not had any problems with feminism. I know where I am, and I've held management and consultancy work across 4 continents. But I can tell you the violence, we're not talking physical. I mean, I have a nose thing hit by a guy called Bomber. The violence against black women in leadership is great. Physical, emotional, and I would say sometimes spiritual. But the woman feminist debate never tackles that. And I'd like everybody here to read the poem Ain't I a Woman by Surgeon Truth, because it says that. And unless we're going to, if we're going to move the feminist agenda forward, we need these intersectional experiences. So we have a core message that all of us can follow and move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just grab, I don't know, yeah, okay, we'll take one here and then we're coming over for 2 over here.
Sorry, that was cheeky, but thank you. I think it's quite telling that the panel tonight, we've not mentioned Theresa May, who obviously is an example of a woman leader, though I think many in the room would have other opinions as well. I'm interested in what the panel thinks about how the rise of partisanship in politics is affecting women's ability to become leaders and how they can act as leaders once they are there.
Sure, thank you. And 2 over here, 1, 2. So in the front.
Hi, I'm Lauren. My background is in political campaigns, but more recently I've swapped into the private sector to see what that's like. And, well, there was a few surprises, I'm not gonna lie. And I think I'm an optimist and a feminist somehow. But I was surprised by a few things. And my question for you on the panel is a little bit around internalized misogyny and how we sort of help women to deal with that, and a little bit about sort of like sharing the burden and like self-care around this sort of stuff. So the first thing is I was really surprised because the company that I work for is full of privilege, white privilege, you know, like socioeconomic privilege. That was shocking to me as well because it's quite a progressive company. And there's a huge amount of women in the company, but many of them do suffer from internalized misogyny, like both openly and sort of without realizing it, all the way from like apologizing for existing all the time in emails, conversations, whatever, to, you know, like not really getting feminism, you know? And like I kind of was lucky enough to work in an environment where I didn't have to have those conversations for a long time. And then suddenly I found myself in that environment where, you know, I've accidentally become the sort of mouthy feminist in the office quite quickly. And people come up to me all the time like, do you really think do we have a problem? You know, like, is it an issue? Are you sure? Are we not undermining women's own successes? You know, like, 1, that's exhausting. But 2, I also find that quite difficult because I get so angry and I get so passionate. And I know that that's really off-putting for people who don't want to have that conversation all the time. So my first question is, how do we deal with that? Like, how can we bring women along who, and not to say that every woman needs to be a raging feminist to be, you know, part of the cause, but like, how do we have those conversations without making it alienating or threatening or like an exclusive club? Because as that lady said, you know, we've got a room with lots of white women in it who have probably benefited from a lot of privilege, as I have. And then the second thing is about self-care. So like when you are the person that people come to about feminism, about equality issues, I found myself really burning out, especially during the Kavanaugh stuff in the States, because I follow that stuff, because I'm a bit, you know, I'm interested in that. But I really struggled. I was finding myself really close to tears all the time. And, you know, how do you look after yourself when, like, people always want to know your opinion and they're coming to you with their opinions and all that sort of stuff?
Thank you. Can you just pass the mic back? We're just getting short of time. Thank you.
My name's Paymana and I'm a Labour councillor in Harrow. The first of my background to be elected, actually. I come from a refugee family. So refugee mums support refugee kids to get ahead, in answer to the question before. But I also work for Plan International UK, and we recently released a report on street harassment in the UK. And 35% of girls in school uniform are harassed in the UK in school uniform. And whilst I was, you know, going through the research for that report, a lot of the girls in their interviews said that boys think it's cool, and they do it mostly when they're in groups. So this type of pack behavior. And so it made me think about, you know, men in the workplace. And I realized actually that pack behavior doesn't really diminish as time goes on. It kind of continues and exists in the workplace, especially with women of color. So as a young woman in politics, I've experienced it where men have sort of backed each other up and said, actually, your experience isn't sexist, your experience isn't racist, and backed each other up, even though they know what's happening, they can see it. So my question is, how do we tackle that? Because that pack behavior is from very young, as some of our research has shown. So thank you.
Some big questions there, and we're going to have to do a quick sweep. So this has become the order. Okay. I'm not sure why. Not sure why. Maybe I just toss my head that way first. Right. But yes, thank you.
So many big questions, and I know others will do justice to them. So I just wanted to pull out a couple of points. First, around intersectionality, thank you. And I think, I mean, what we kind of in our work as unions do is try and foreground people's experiences in a recognition that we're all kind of three-dimensional human beings. We don't exist in one kind of particular characteristic or another. Our experiences are intersectional. How we then translate that into our campaigning and our policy work and so on, I think is the key question, and kind of in terms of the work that we're doing, both in terms of like recognising and supporting reps and developing reps, recognising that often union reps are also kind of bridges into other kind of community activity, anti-racist activity, community groups, tenants and residents associations. Like often these women who are reps are in the rest of their life holding these kind of incredible bridging and leadership roles locally, and sort of harnessing that in everything that we do, I think, is really important. And just one other thing, I think that question about how do we bring all women with us, I think even if the sort of political perspective from which women approach issues is not always shared, then a lot of our experience is common. And we did this piece of work as the TUC a couple of years ago around sexual harassment, found that more than half of women had experienced sexual harassment. Only 1 in 5 had reported it to their employer. Huge story. But none of us were surprised when we found the figures. You know, we know that is our reality and it's our experience. And I think using kind of direct experience and then kind of bridging from that to the political conversation about, well, what do we need to change to stop this happening is one way in.
I've got long hours, leadership trainee schemes, etc. I would just ask who monitors that, because it's only kind of through some legislation that they're going to be held to account. You know, they've done stuff around internships, parliamentary kind of workers and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of, if it is important, the only way to stop it is for it to be monitored and for people to be named and shamed. Otherwise, it's not going to go away. Privilege, I actually spoke to Julia last week about exactly the same thing and where kind of black women fit into that whole kind of women's movement. Our experience, difference does need to be recognised. One of the things I said to her was I felt that in Britain in particular, and we see this with Sean Bailey the other week, where it's kind of, there are stereotypes about kind of African and Caribbean women come from this matriarchal kind of lineage, and that is not true. You know, I think the Caribbean has just had its second female prime minister since German independence in the 70s. So, and there's, if you look at some of the social policies that were put in place from about the 70s, particularly around housing, single parent benefits, all that kind of stuff, there's actually a social construct that has led kind of black women down a particular line in Britain, and I think that's a huge piece to be looked at. The other thing I discussed with Julia was Theresa May. Now, I'm going to put it out there. I'm a Labour Party member. I'm very proud to be a Labour Party member, especially under the current leadership, and I hope I'm a Labour Party member till the day I die. So I am a fan of Miss May. But when you look at what's happened to her in comparison to buffoon Boris, clearly gendered. And, you know, 21st century, don't know. I think she should resign, but I think that Janine, she has had a worse time than anything else, and solely because of her gender. It doesn't help her coming onto the stage dancing to Dancing
The
Queen.
thing is we expect her to be human in a way we wouldn't expect a man to be human.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, not many men are that human. Do you know what I mean? Like, no, I don't mean normal men. I mean political men.
Yeah.
Like political leader men. You know, David Cameron was nothing like me, or, you know, but we expect her, like, the whole Wheatfield thing, it's a shit answer. I'm not going to defend her, but we expect her to be more like able to be like, yeah, I just swig Prosecco with the girls every night. Like, she's the Prime Minister. Cut her some slack. She doesn't need to come up with those stupid answers. But the fact that, and the question, I know this isn't the question that you asked, but the question I often get asked, and it's a sort of about partisanship, is why have the Tories had 2 women leaders and the Labour Party hasn't, is because Theresa May and Margaret Thatcher were both willing to keep the power where it currently exists, the established order, and they don't necessarily, although Theresa May is better than Margaret Thatcher, fight for massive changes, shifts and changes for women in the country. And Labour women would do that. And unfortunately, the Labour Party, those women, it's much harder for them to rise because they threaten the established power order, even in the Labour Party. And men in the Labour Party go like, oh, you meant me? I had to step aside. Oh, no, I thought you were talking about the other men. Obviously, I'm totally woke and I really want a woman, but I don't... You meant me? Oh, no, I'm not going to step aside. So, but if there was a woman in the Labour Party who was willing to toe the men in the Labour Party's line, she would have been the leader by now. But those women, I'm quite proud to say, don't necessarily exist so much in the Labour Party. So that's a good thing, but it does hamper power. It is utterly tiring. At the moment in Parliament, I have been the repository of almost every single story about sexual harassment and sexual violence and bullying and harassment, and to the point of, you know, definite secondary harm to myself, because then also the responsibility, what that does is means that you have to fight for it, and nobody wants to hear it. I know the newspapers like to hear it, actually, that's true, they want to hear it, but it doesn't win you friends. It means I have to walk around Parliament with my head down. I'm the one avoiding eye contact, not the people who've behaved in this appalling way, because I'm the one who speaks out about it. and it is incredibly tiring, and people shouldn't be expected to do it on their own. And I suppose the union movement, in answer to your question about how migrant women and refugee women working in low-paid jobs, there is no better example than brilliant, really working class, terribly put upon women rose up through the ranks of the union movement. They are some of the only examples we actually have of really, but that is done with a collective, and we shouldn't try and do those things alone. And if you feel that you are the person doing it all on your own, you've got to try and find a way to stop it, because it is you being a hero like that. Nobody will ever thank you. Women, no one will thank you, and you will burn yourself out, and you won't be able to change anything if you have to give up because it's been so awful.
Well, our time together in this format is drawing to a close. It's been a incredibly interesting conversation on the question of burnout. People burn out if they don't get to eat and drink, and so that is what is going to happen next. But before we do that, can I ask you to join me in thanking our panellists who have taken us all sorts of ways. Thank you.
You are excellent. Let's hang out. I knew I liked you. I knew I could feel a strong bond of Birmingham.
Please stay in touch. The website's there. Please stay in touch with our work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and please stay and enjoy this kind of networking. Thank you very much.